Well, good morning again, church. Let's turn our Bibles to Genesis chapter 16. Genesis chapter 16 as we pick up from where we left off a few weeks ago. Genesis chapter 16. You know, I despise social media for many reasons, right? I mean, just look at all the crazy misinformation and disinformation we saw this past week. People exploiting the tragedy of a hurricane with conspiracy theories and AI-generated images for political ends, financial schemes. It's just depressing, isn't it? Social media certainly comes with a lot of ills. But I'll tell you one thing I do like about social media. I like a good meme. Y'all know what I'm talking about? I love a good meme, don't you? Especially one that's on point, like it's almost scary how much you relate to it. It's like someone has been spying on you because you saw that post. Before you saw that post, you thought you were the only one who thought that way. There's a saying when you come across a meme like that. What is it? I feel seen, right? It's like someone has seen into the depths of your soul and summed you up in one single image, like this one up here. Me, I'm going to eat healthy. Also me, right? Kid's my spirit animal right there. I feel seen. Or what about this one? Me, when I'm finally finished doing everything by myself instead of simply asking for help. Some of you moms feel seen by that one, don't you? Especially after this week. Or what about this one for all the introverts in the house? So tell me about yourself. Me, trying to remember who I am. Do you feel seen? Here's one for anyone that's ever had a brother or a sister. When you accidentally hurt your sibling and frantically apologize before mom finds out. Anybody been there? Guilty. I definitely feel seen. Have you ever had this moment when you're looking for an adult to handle the situation and realize you're the adult? It kind of takes me back to my early days of youth ministry, where the struggle is real with this next one. My houseplant watching me pour water in my espresso machine. I couldn't keep a plant alive to save my life. It's so bad, y'all, I can't even keep a succulent from dying. I feel seen. Or who struggles with this one here? If my mouth doesn't say it, then my face definitely will. Yeah, some of y'all doing that to me right now. It's all right. It's okay. All right. Or what about this one? Trying to stay awake after I said, let's watch a movie. The spirit is willing, right? Or what about this one? When you get home and someone's eating up all the food you've been thinking about all day. That's the worst, right? I don't know what it says about me, y'all, but I relate most to the food ones. I feel seen. Like this one, I wish I loved exercise as much as I love napping 3 times a day and eating 5 times the suggested serving size. Y'all, I'd settle for 1 nap a day, but the suggested serving size, that's me, all right? Or have you ever done this? When I give advice, I always end with, I don't know though. So if it ruins their life, it's not my fault. Some of y'all struggle with that, don't you? Or what about this? When you have to be at work at 9, but you left the house at 8:58. I think I've seen some of you on the road in that moment, but maybe this one's more your speed. You have the motivational speaker saying, you can achieve anything you want. You have a lion in you. But the lion in you looks like this guy, right? Finally, what about this one? When your winter body shows up way earlier than you had anticipated. Seen, totally seen. It's ridiculous, isn't it? But there's just something about knowing there's someone out there who gets you, right? Even on some small level, some small part of you who understands your experience and meets you where you are. There's something inside all of us that craves that, isn't there? To know and to be known. And not just with the silly things, but with the big things. That someone out there sees you, recognizes what you're going through, comes alongside you, even works good for you. And you know, as fun as it is when it feels like a meme has seen you, aren't you thankful this morning that there's a God who actually does see you? Who knows you all the way to your innermost part and not only takes notice of you, but cares for you, loves you. Friend, whatever you're going through this morning, you should feel seen this morning because there's a God who sees. That's something Abram and Sarai should have known for themselves at this point. After all, God saw them and sought them out when they were living as pagans in Ur. He rescued them out of Egypt. He brought them to the land of promise and saw them through literal battle. And when Abram was at his lowest, questioning if the promise of a child and the inheritance of a land would actually come true, God met him in that moment and saw every hurt, every pain, every fear, and he wasn't angry. He wasn't even annoyed. He patiently heard all that was in Abram's heart and answered him in a power beyond anything Abram could have imagined, swearing by the stars and the sand, the heavens and the earth, vowing that if God were to ever break his promise to Abram, God himself would be torn in two. Indeed, he would be slaughtered even if Abram was the one to break faith. An impossible feat, but a sure guarantee that no matter what, Abram would have a son and his descendants would have a home. But instead of resting in that promise of trusting in the one who has seen them and known them and loved them, Abram and Sarai were going to have to learn this lesson all over again the hard way. And this lesson was going to come from an unlikely source and through a very costly mistake. Look at chapter 16, starting in verse 1. It says, "Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. She had a female Egyptian servant, most likely given to her by Pharaoh, whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, 'Behold, now the Lord has prevented me from bearing children.'" So just as Abram had to work through his grief last week, so now do we find Sarai working through her grief. And that's totally natural. It's to be expected, but we see something different happening here. Because whereas Abram brought all his questions to God, notice Sarai is casting blame on God. You can hear the bitterness just seeping in, can't you? Like, we were told we would have children, but here we are 10 years later, and what do we have to show for it? This had to be especially painful for Sarai. Indeed, she probably felt all alone in her struggle at this point, because in the last chapter, Abram was assured that the heir God had promised them would not be a designated relative or servant. No, God promised there would be a son. And the son, he said, would come from Abram's own loins. In other words, Abram would produce a biological child. But Sarai must be thinking, what about me? He did not even mention me. Am I not a part of this plan? Or worse, am I actually getting in the way of this plan? This would have been a natural assumption for Sarai, because in the ancient world, a woman's entire worth was bound up in whether she could produce offspring. As we saw last week, this wasn't just a matter of joy, the joy of having children, but also a matter of survival. Because if a childless couple made it into old age, like Abram and Sarai, who would take care of them once their health began to wane? This was so crucial that in some societies back then, it was considered a legitimate option to divorce your wife after a period of time if she could not produce an heir. So in despair, Sarai is probably thinking, I've failed Abram. Or worse, I failed God. Doesn't that just break your heart for Sarai? She feels worthless at this point. She wants to be used by God, but she doesn't see the fruit of God in her life. See, Sarai thought her value was in what she could contribute, but that's not how God works. Remember, his promise last week was that from beginning to end, this whole thing was going to depend not on them, but on him. He's going to get the glory. Indeed, we bring nothing to the table in our relationship with God. We're sinners. The only thing we deserve is to die. So we're powerless to save ourselves. We're powerless to help ourselves. That's what this whole journey was supposed to show us and to show them. That if there's going to be any hope for any of us, it's going to have to come from God. That God was going to have to make this happen. Sarai only had to wait. She had to wait for the Lord. Indeed, she had not been forgotten. If only she had remembered that when none of the men in Egypt, including her own husband Abram, were concerned for her well-being, God was still paying attention to her. God was still looking out for her. Indeed, he cared for her and he rescued her because God saw her. If she had only remembered that, she could have saved herself and everyone else around her a lot of pain. But instead of walking by faith here, Sarai is overwhelmed by fear. And so instead of trusting in God's wisdom, she follows the wisdom that she's used to, the wisdom of the culture she grew up in. See, there was a custom in the ancient world that if a man's wife could not bear children of her own, she could offer her maidservant to her husband to marry, and this maidservant could produce children on her behalf as a surrogate mother. So, aha, Sarai thinks, just like Abram thought that maybe God was going to use the ancient custom of adopting a servant to fulfill his promise to them, Sarai thinks, well, God only mentioned that the child would come from Abram's loins. Perhaps this is what God wants me to do, to selflessly step aside and let this child come from my husband's loins, but through my maidservant. And in this way, God is going to provide us with a child. Indeed, Sarai probably had good motives here, convincing herself that this was God's will. But if she wanted to know God's will, she probably should have stopped and asked him. Because notice, at no point here is God even consulted. Sarai never prays. Instead, Sarai tells Abram, what does it say? Go in to my servant. It may be that I shall obtain children by her. See, Sarai simply does what is right in her own eyes. She's thinking, like Abram did in Egypt, the ends justify the means. If the ends are good, then I can use whatever means I must to get there. But as we've seen, God doesn't just care about the ends, he cares about how we get there. And that's true in every area of life, including the good desire to bring children into the world, to fulfill God's command for married couples to be fruitful and to multiply. Friends, that is a good end, one that every married couple should pursue. But unfortunately, many people today, in a desire to achieve this good end, make the same mistake as Sarai, failing to consider whether the means they are using to achieve that end are pleasing to God. Thankfully, in our modern world, there are amazing fertility treatments available for childless couples. Even still, we must make sure that if we use these fertility treatments, we do so ethically in accordance to what God has shown us in his word. For instance, while technology can help a husband and a wife conceive, some have used that same technology to unite the sperm of a husband with the egg of a woman who is not his wife, or the egg of a wife to a man, the sperm of a man who is not her husband. But friends, think about what we have just done in those two cases. We have brought together two things that should have never been brought together, violating the one flesh covenant of one man and one woman united for life, thereby creating what? The fruit of adultery. Now hear me. Every life is sacred. A child produced in this way has no less dignity or worth. Indeed, he or she is a precious creation made in the image of God, just as a child conceived in the act of adultery would be. A child can't help how he or she was conceived, but that doesn't make the means of conception morally good. We cannot walk by our own wisdom here, church, seeking to accomplish something good through an unholy means. That was the way sin first entered the world in the garden in the first place. Another important factor to think through in this is this. Because this technology is so expensive, some have used this technology to create more embryos than they intend to bring to term, so they have plenty of embryos to work with. Many of those embryos then die in the process, and the extra embryos are often intentionally destroyed or frozen indefinitely. But if life begins at conception, as we believe the Bible teaches, what we do, even with the tiniest of human beings, matters. These are not clumps of cells, nor are they products for consumption. These are little image bearers, our children, who are of infinite value and dignity and worthy of our care and our love. So while it is good and it is right to desire to have a child, as Sarai did, we must be careful that we do not merely practice what is acceptable in our culture, again, as Sarai did. The ends do not justify the means. We must be very careful that whatever technology we use to assist us with fertility is utilized in a way that is pleasing to God. See, Sarai thinks she is doing something completely acceptable here, because she's going along with what is common in her culture. She's leaning on her own understanding instead of seeking God's will, just like Eve did in the garden. And just like Adam listened to the voice of Eve, so too does it say in verse 2, Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. See, just like Adam stood by and let his wife be deceived by the serpent in the garden when he had heard from God himself the sure promise that if they ate from that one tree, they would surely die, so too does Abram forsake his role as the spiritual leader of the home, so too does he ignore the clear divine instruction and promises, and so too does he choose to follow his wife instead of obeying the voice of God. And just as Eve took the fruit from the tree and gave it to her husband, so too does it tell us here this in verse 3. It says, so after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, the Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to Abram, her husband, as a wife. And he went in to Hagar, and she conceived. Now, from a cultural perspective, this is really good news, right? Abram had been promised by God that he would have a son, and they finally figured out how it was going to happen. Here they are a decade later, and they finally achieved success. But again, God wasn't looking for their help. He was looking for them to trust him to be their help. This was not the way God had determined to work out his purpose in their lives. And in their attempt to solve one problem with their own wisdom, they were about to introduce a flood of other problems. Because when we don't do things God's way, it never leads to shalom. It leads to discord and chaos. And they've just ushered in some major chaos in their homes. Look at verse 4. It says that when Hagar saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. Honestly, who could blame her at this point? There's a lot that's wrong with this picture, which means this contempt was probably multi-layered. First of all, while this was a common practice in the ancient world, Sarai, just like Abram in Egypt, wasn't thinking about how his actions would affect others. She just wanted a solution for herself. And just as Abram thoughtlessly pimped out his wife in Egypt to save his own hide, so too has Sarai now pimped out her powerless servant to save hers. And in so doing, she failed to see Hagar as a person, as a divine image bearer. She just saw Hagar as an object at her disposal to satisfy her own purposes. Sarai hadn't seen Hagar. She had used Hagar, and therefore she had sinned against Hagar because she had mistreated Hagar. Hagar had every right to be angry. Nevertheless, and this is the messy nature of sin, having been sinned against, Hagar doesn't seek to deal with that sin in a constructive way that leads to repentance. Instead, she too sins by returning evil for evil in retaliation. Because having conceived, she now views herself as superior to Sarai, perhaps seeing this as an opportunity for personal advancement in her station. She, and not her mistress, would bear her master's son. And as such, she would curry the favor of her master and no longer function as a servant, but as the favored matron of the household and seemingly as the mother of the child of the promise. Other ancient codes, such as Hammurabi, had warned of such a situation, and they made clear that even while the servant may have become a wife, the first wife still had a special status, and the servant wife was a servant nonetheless who was to submit to the first wife. But this is all just sinful man trying to deal with the sin of man. This is not the way it should have been in the first place, because this is not God's design for marriage. He showed us in Genesis 2:24 that the order of creation was for one man to be united with one woman for life. Polygamy is a violation of God's good design, and yet it was common in the ancient world, particularly among the wealthy and the powerful, even within Israel, as we'll see throughout the Old Testament, and yet it is never approved by God. Indeed, in virtually every case in Scripture, it always leads to manifold problems. And if Abram and Sarai didn't have enough problems on their own, they've now just unleashed war within their own household. And no one wants to take responsibility for it. Just like in the garden, when everyone wanted to blame someone else other than themselves, so too do Abram and Sarai start pointing fingers. Look at verse 5. Sarai said to Abram, "May the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my servant to your embrace. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me." It's like, whoa, Sarai,
This was your idea, sister friend, because remember, awkward fact, Abram's wife was indeed his sister friend. And she's like, but this was a test, Abram, right? It's kind of like men, when your wife asks if you think someone is pretty, it's always a trap. Don't walk into it. Just bust out the lines of that classic Flamingo song. My love must be a kind of blind love. I can't see anyone but you, because I only have eyes for you, right? Shabbat, Shabbat, right? That's what Abram should have done. It was a trap. And now Sarai's ticked at Abram for sleeping with Hagar, and Abram's like, baby, I was just doing what you told me to do. Nevertheless, this would have been a really great opportunity for Abram to step up as the spiritual leader of the home he was called to be and admit that he had fallen short in his leadership by passively following Sarai and not trusting the Lord. And while he couldn't go back and undo the bad he's done, he could have turned from his sin. He could have asked for Sarai's forgiveness. He could have asked for Hagar's forgiveness. He could have asked for God's forgiveness and worked to reestablish shalom in the home, showing respect and grace for everyone involved. But once again, Abram's going to wimp out. He's going to shift the responsibility onto his wife. Listen to what he says in verse 6. Abram said to Sarai, behold, your servant is in your power. Do to her however you please. Notice, even though Abram is supposed to be the leader of his household, he's effectively told Sarai, this is your problem. You created this mess. You fix it. It's like, come on, bro. I mean, you played a pretty significant role here, too. I mean, the baby didn't produce itself. You know what I mean? So by failing in his leadership role here, he has no regard for the terrible position he's put his wife in. She already felt insecure because of her body's inability to conceive, but now he's going to stand by and let another woman treat her with disdain? What an awful situation he has put her in. And yes, Sarai is culpable too, but Abram was in the driver's seat. He made the decision to take his family in this direction. He did this. The mess belongs to him, just like the mess originally belonged to Adam. Nevertheless, while he's put Sarai in a terrible situation, he's put Hagar in a horrific situation. First of all, by joining with his wife and treating her as an object to be used instead of a person to be valued. But now she too is his wife. She shouldn't be, but she is. And so he now has responsibilities to her as well. And Sarai may not like it, but Hagar is also Abram's baby mama now. She is carrying his child. And for that reason alone, he owes her respect. He is obligated to protect her and his unborn offspring. And yet, instead of taking up for them, he, like so many men today, cowardly neglects his God-given responsibilities. The man who would come to be known as Father Abraham starts out as a deadbeat dad. And men today need to hear this. You were designed by God to lovingly lead your family by pointing them to Jesus. When you fall down on that job, it only invites disaster upon your home. But men, listen to me. Even when you fall short, listen, you have an obligation to do what you can by God's grace to set things right. Listen, every dude makes mistakes. Some have had to live with bigger consequences than others, but you don't run from those consequences. You own up to those consequences. And even in the brokenness, you show the goodness of God at work in you as you seek to mend what was broken. Listen, if you have a child, men, you have an obligation to provide for and protect that child and to be a father to that child. Abram is skirting his responsibility. Even though after 85 years without a child, he now has one on the way. Even though the events leading to this child's conception were not pleasing to the Lord, all of life is precious to God. And he could have trusted God to work good even here as he saw it not to continue in evil, but to turn from evil and pursue what is good. But instead, Abram punts. He's passive. But his passivity doesn't make him less culpable here. Indeed, as the spiritual leader, it makes him more culpable. Abram chose not to see. He told his hurting first wife that she was on her own, and he has turned his servant wife and their child over to a woman scorned. He failed to see Sarai. He failed to see Hagar. So it's no surprise that we find out in verse 6, Sarai dealt harshly with Hagar, and Hagar fled from her. See, sin left untreated always leads to more sin. We now have a broken marriage. We have a fractured household. The seed of Abram is now separated from his father. All the promises of God seem to be in jeopardy once more. And you'd think at this point God would have just been done with the whole thing. I mean, Abram and Sarai had the whole world handed to them on a silver platter, just like Adam and Eve did in the garden. But with Adam and Eve, it was just a piece of fruit. Here we have something far worse. They've treated Hagar like a piece of flesh. How much more worthy of God's wrath would they be? Surely theirs is the wage of sin. Surely they deserve to die. But remember God's promise. It was unconditional. He swore by heaven and earth to redeem Abram and all of humanity through him. He swore that even if Abram were to break faithfulness to the covenant, even then God himself would pay the price. It would not be Abram's own righteousness that would save him, because Abram's a sinner just like the rest of us. No, it will be by grace through faith that Abram will be counted righteous and ultimately be made righteous. So even though Abram deserved to be cast aside like Hagar was by Sarai, God is not done with him yet. And my friend, I'm here to tell you today, he's not done with you yet. Listen, I don't care what's in your background. If God didn't give up on Abram and Sarai, as messed up as they were, what makes you think he's going to give up on you? Listen, he paid the price for you too. He, just like those animals in the covenant that were split in two, on the cross, the God-man Jesus had his flesh ripped and mangled so yours didn't have to be. Sinless Jesus bore the wrath of God and the death penalty for your sin so that you too could be reconciled to God. And all you have to do is ask. Ask, and he will hear you. Because my friend, he sees you. And he longs to bring his grace into your messy situation, no matter how messy it is. That's what he does with Abram here. Because what a mess Abram has made. But aren't you thankful this morning that nothing is too messy for our God? So even though Abram deserves it, God will not turn his back on him. But neither will he turn his back on Hagar. Look at verse 7. The angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. Now we'll see this more as we continue through Genesis, but often when the angel of the Lord is mentioned, it is actually God himself, who is invisible, making himself visible by appearing in a physical form. And that's what he's done here with Hagar. And when everyone else has treated Hagar like an object, the God of the universe condescends himself to interact with her as a person. Because while God has set apart Abram and Sarai, he has not done so to exclude people from other nations. It is through Abram and Sarai that God is going to bless all nations. Abram and Sarai may have fallen down on the job here, but God isn't about to. He says this to Hagar in verse 8, Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? She said, I'm fleeing from my mistress Sarai. The angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit to her. See, like Abram and Sarai, Hagar is acting out of her own wisdom here. She doesn't even know where she's going. She just wants to get as far away from the problem as possible. But what she has chosen is certain death. Not only because she finds herself in a literal wilderness without food or water at this point, but also because a single mother in the ancient world did not stand a chance. Even if she were to survive, her life would have been one of utter destitution and ostracization. But in his mercy, God stops her. He tells her not to lean on her own understanding, but to trust in him instead, to lean into his wisdom, to step back and just watch him work. Because yes, Abram and Sarai have sinned grievously against Hagar, and God is going to deal with them for that. But nevertheless, the covenant is still with them. Not by their works, but by his grace. And little by little, God's going to be leading Abram out of his old way of life and into a new life of grace and faith. This will be the power of God at work in him. But the power of God is with him. And so God reminds Hagar that while she has every right to run away with Abram's child, as we saw the other week with Lot, there is no blessing apart from Abram, because listen, there is no blessing apart from the God of Abram. And so in his love, God beckons Hagar to return to Abram because God has a plan for her too. And he has a plan for the child that she carries. Indeed, he says in verse 10, I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for multitude. In other words, she's going to share in the very blessing given to Abram because she is a wife of Abram. She's carrying the son of Abram. But God isn't going to stop there because God isn't just going to allow her to flourish through many descendants. No, like Abram and Sarai, she's going to flourish because she herself has access to the source of flourishing, the very God of the universe. That's why God goes on to say this in verse 11, behold, you're pregnant, and you shall bear a son. And you shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. The child's name Ishmael literally means God hears. And it says that God has heard her cry for help. Aren't you thankful to know that whatever you're going through today, there is a God who not only hears you, but meets you where you are, especially if you're being mistreated? As Psalm 9:12 says, he does not forget the cry of the afflicted. Listen, God will not turn a blind eye to injustice, no matter who does it. We saw this back with Cain and Abel, where we're told that the voice of Abel's blood cried out to God from the ground for justice. And the Israelites themselves found God's faithfulness in this, and that while they were suffering as slaves in Egypt, much like Hagar, the Egyptian slave, was suffering under their ancestral father in Canaan, God heard their cries for help, causing him to remember his covenant with Abram and to send Moses in to deliver them. What a comfort it must have been to the Israelites to know that theirs is a God who hears, who is mindful of our suffering, and who delivers all who call on him, even when that call comes from an Egyptian of all people. Because the gospel is for all people. Indeed, as the Israelites themselves saw, God counted even some Egyptians as his people, as several Egyptian families left their homeland with the Israelites in the Exodus to become citizens of the promised land. Even some wicked Canaanites would likewise turn from their sin and follow the one true God and become members of Israel, such as the prostitute Rahab. Again, this was God's plan all along, that through the descendants of Abram, people from every nation would come to know him. People like you and me. And Hagar is doing just that. She too is learning to turn from her sin and trust in the God of Abram. Nevertheless, God warns Hagar that her son, verse 12, shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen. Indeed, her son will be the source and the recipient of much discord, and we're going to see that begin even within the household of Abram as jealousies arise not only between Hagar and Sarai, but also between Ishmael and the true child of the promise, Isaac. Indeed, it is the descendants of Ishmael, that it is to the descendants of Ishmael that Isaac's grandson, Joseph, will be sold by his own brothers into slavery. But nevertheless, unlike Hagar, Ishmael will not live a life of servitude. Indeed, as the son of the patriarch Abram, we're told in Genesis 17, he will become the father of 12 princes and will himself be a great nation. He too will receive a blessing. Hagar, like Abram, believes this. She believes in the promise of God. She responds in faith. Indeed, it says in verse 13, so she called on the name of the Lord who spoke to her. This is the same response we see other people of faith have in Genesis, including the descendants of Seth in Genesis 4:26. And she says, you are a God of seeing. For she said, truly, here I have seen him who looks after me. Therefore, the well was called Bir Lahairoi, the well of the living one who sees me. And it lies between Kadesh and Bered. Why does Hagar put her faith in the God of Abraham? Because, she says, you are a God of seeing. Not only do you know what I have been through, you have taken time to know me. You not only see me, you look after me. You will take care of me. See, Hagar's just beginning to find this out. But again, Abram should have known better. Nevertheless, God is about to humble him and teach him a lesson through none other than his servant girl, who is now his wife. Because when Hagar comes home, look at verse 15. Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram called the name of his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abram. Now, what does that mean? It means that, like his God, Abram too has now seen Hagar. He has now heard Hagar. More than that, he has heard the word of the Lord through Hagar, and he has received that word from the Lord by faith. Abram too has repented. He has not continued in his sin. Instead, he is taking responsibility for his actions and rising to his calling to be a faithful father to his boy. Indeed, in ancient cultures, by naming him, he is acknowledging him as his son. And he's obeying God's command to name the boy God hears, as a permanent reminder to Abram and Sarai of how this is supposed to work. They need to stop scheming. They don't need to figure this out with their own might and wit. There's a God who hears. There is a God who cares. There is a God who sees. And if they simply cry out to him in prayer, God will hear that prayer and supply their every need. All they have to do is ask. And my friend, all you have to do is ask. Listen, perhaps like Abram and Sarai, you've made your life a disaster. Did you know that God is really good at bringing beauty even from disaster? Did you know that God is good at bringing all things to good? Did you know that no matter how far gone you may feel, you're never beyond his reach if you will confess and turn from your sin and trust in him? If you will ask him? Because the God of Abraham knew that Abram was going to make some serious mistakes, and yet even here, God is working out the blessing. He's even taking the mistakes that Abram has made to fulfill his own promise to Abram, that he would make him not only the father of a single nation, but the father of many nations. And just as God didn't give up on Abram, my friend, he's not about to give up on you. He sees you. He hears you. He knows you. Friend, he loves you. Again, he loved you so much that he parted with his own son, his sinless son, who willingly died for you, taking the punishment that you deserved so that you could be grafted into this family line, so that you too could become a child of Abraham. And if a child, the Bible says, then you are an heir according to the promise. Listen, I don't care who you are, where you've been, what you've done, my friend, you can be forgiven. You can be restored. All you have to do is ask. Ask, Jesus said, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and the door will be open, because he sees you. He hears you. He wants to be with you. He wants to be for you. And thank God he's made a way for that to happen. So come behold and come home to the God who sees. Come see and be seen. And if you do, you too can become a child in the household of God. Will you pray with me?